Good morning. If you could please start taking your seats, we're going to start in a couple of minutes.
Available for sale.
Good luck.
You look great. Good morning. Okay, we're on the last lap here. We got a great day of programming. My name is Clark Bell. I'm the Journalism Program Director of the McCormick Foundation, or as I'm known around here, the other Clark. This morning, we'll discuss media coverage of counterterrorism issues. Before introducing our moderator, I'd like to go over some of the results of the survey we invited you to participate in a few days ago. 85 of you did participate, and here are a few highlights. When asked if national security journalists are developing sufficient expertise to cover these complicated issues, 32% said yes, 68% answered no. However, when asked how the public can best remain informed and engaged on security issues, 95% said through responsible and effective journalism. And then finally, when asked the most important factor in resolving current tensions between the government security agencies and the media, 25% said increased government transparency, 36% said more healthy cooperation between the government officials and journalists, and 37% said none, meaning the tension between the security agencies and the media cannot be diffused and will remain an enduring characteristic of our time. Now I'll turn it over to Kimberly Dozier, one of the nation's premier intelligence and special operations journalists. In a sterling 20-plus year career with the Associated Press, and before that CBS News, Kim has become a primary source for millions and millions of Americans on military and security issues. Please join me in welcoming Kim Dozier, who will introduce her panel.
Clark, thank you very much. Thank you, Clark, and thank you, Clark, and the Aspen Institute for having us back. And I am sitting with an amazing panel that I will introduce to you now, who also reach millions of people on counterterrorism issues. So right next to me, we have Dan Klaidman. He's a special correspondent at Newsweek and the Daily Beast, and author of Kill or Capture, The War on Terror and the Soul of the Obama Presidency. From 2006 to 2011, he was Newsweek's managing editor, and prior to that, he was the magazine's Washington bureau chief during the attacks of 9/11. Next to Dan, we have Mark Mazzetti. He's a national security correspondent at the New York Times, focusing on American intelligence agencies and making me work harder. He's author of The Way of the Knife, The CIA, A Secret Army, and A War at the Ends of the Earth. And providing counterpoint, we have PJ Crowley. He is the former Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs under the Obama administration from 2009 to early 2011. He's a retired Air Force colonel and currently a fellow at the Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication at George Washington University. With that, I will tackle our topic. Now, some of the reporters in the room are used to being under fire, but in the last year, it's felt like some of them are under fire here in the States, or at least some of their sources are. The Justice Department has a number of leak investigations underway, triggered in part by coverage from the New York Times and other outlets. The Director of National Intelligence's Inspector General has an unprecedented number of internal investigations into media leaks, something like more than 100. And only this week, the New York Times' James Risen lost his case at a Virginia appeals court. The judge ruled that reporter's privilege does not allow Risen to decline to identify the source of classified information that he revealed in his book, State of War. I'll read a little bit from the 4th District Court's Chief Judge William Traxler. His decision said, "There is no First Amendment testimonial privilege that protects a reporter from being compelled to testify by the prosecution or the defense in criminal proceedings about criminal conduct that the reporter personally witnessed or participated in, even though the reporter promised confidentiality to his source." So Risen has said he'll appeal, and if necessary, he's said he'll go to jail to protect his sources. With that, I turn to the authors sitting next to me, who both revealed classified information in their books, to ask you, summarize your books. What was the point of writing them? What story did you hope to tell? Dan?
Thanks, Kimberly. I set off to basically trace the evolution of Obama's views and policies on counterterrorism. And I wanted to do it in a narrative fashion with characters and scenes and flesh and blood, and try to use it as a prism to look at his leadership style. And when I started the book in, I guess it was late 2009, narrative had already been fairly well established that Obama's policies were looking suspiciously like George Bush's, and that far from being the liberal constitutionalist who was going to roll back the Bush-Cheney policies, he was embracing many of them, if not all of them, and that it was more continuity rather than change. And I wanted to sort of explore that premise. It's more complicated than that. Maybe we'll be able to get into that a little bit. But I wanted to explore that premise and try to understand why he pursued the policies that he ultimately pursued. And in doing that, I thought that you really had to understand how these extremely difficult decisions got made. And both inside the bureaucracy and at the leadership level with Obama himself. Brutally hard decisions that pit security against liberty, transparency against secrecy, politics against principle, a lot of the tensions that we've been talking about at this conference. And so, I think we are good in this day and age at dissecting policies, whether it's with blogs or quick takes or tweets, and understanding whether they're legal or moral or wise. But we're less good at really understanding how these decisions get made, and the sort of human motivations behind them, and how people, policymakers, and the president himself deal with the kind of conflicting pressures, the moral complexities, the legal difficulties. And so I wanted to try to do that and lay bare the kind of human dimensions of decisions that ultimately are life and death decisions. And to try to give readers as vivid a portrait as possible as to what that's really like. What's it like to be in the room when you're making a targeted killing decision, for example. And that's what led me to Jay Johnson. I think Mike Isikoff mentioned him yesterday, who, after his first targeted killing, participating in his first targeted killing, said, if I were Catholic, I'd have to go to confession. By the way, just a little bit of context, That was a targeted killing in the south of Yemen in 2009 that went badly awry. Dozens of civilians were killed in that attack. Or Jay Johnson's counterpart at the State Department, Harold Koh, who was the former dean of the Yale Law School and probably the most revered human rights lawyer of his generation, saying, how did I go from being a law professor to being involved in killing? How did I go from memorizing the names and faces of my students, bright-eyed idealists who wanted to change the world using the law, to memorizing and studying the profiles of vacant-eyed militants and participating in the decisions about which one of them should live and which one of them should die. And then along the way, the extraordinary specter of a president who, at the very outset of his presidency, made the decision that he wanted to make many of these killing decisions on his own. Why did he do that? How did he approach these decisions? He continued to sort of wrestle with many of these tough issues in a way that was impressive, but in a way that also had a sort of a downside to his leadership style. It led to a lot of vacillating and temporizing and stalling, which could be maddening to many of his advisors. And the last thing I'll say, but the other side of the equation, and which also goes to his leadership style, was that it showed a kind of flexibility and suppleness in decision making that he was able to go back and kind of re-examine his policies in the face of changing circumstances on the ground, and a kind of leadership style that I think very much led to the NDU speech, where he is now trying to take this war into a very different direction. So that's what I was trying to do with this book.
Got it. Mark, The Way of the Knife.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me out here. It's been a tremendous few days, and it's a tremendous conference. It's great to be up here with this panel. So my book is an attempt to tell a history, as much of a history that can be told up to this point, of what I call the shadow war, which is the history of the war outside of the war zones since 9/11. And as I write, so much of the important part of what has happened over the last 12 years happened away from Iraq and Afghanistan. And I felt that a lot of the sort of contours of those wars had been well explained in a lot of great books and a lot of great journalism, but that there needed to be an attempt to sort of tell the history of the war in Pakistan, tell the history of the beginning of the war in Yemen up until today, talk about how the CIA was put in charge of these wars and how it has changed the CIA over this period of time. So the book is a sort of look at how sort of targeted killing, how these wars using drones, special operations, intelligence officers have sort of become, in many ways, the default way we do business now, and especially in light of the drawdowns in the big wars and the movement, as Dan wrote about so well, also the movement towards these sort of smaller wars that are considered, cleaner, cheaper, all sorts of things, but in many ways they're not, at least on the being cleaner side. So sort of an examination of what happens when you go to war, when you can't send in the Marines. Who do you rely on? And so that brought me into a lot of different directions, but it was sort of looking at some of the characters. What does this way of war, what does it produce? Who does it produce? Who is able to thrive in this environment and operate through, either in private contracting or running private spy services or all sorts of different things that make this sort of rich history of this war, and I sort of tried to flesh out some of those characters, and then examine. My hope was also to be able to sort of tell different sides. I went to Pakistan to talk to civilians, government officials, military intelligence officials, because a lot of the book is actually an examination of the U.S.-Pakistan relationship, and more specifically the CIA-ISI relationship, which is, in many ways, I think the most fascinating relationship since 9/11. And you heard Hussein Haqqani yesterday talk about aspects of that, and it's complex, it's maddening, it's it's frustrating, it's dysfunctional, which for a reporter makes it all the more interesting. And then ultimately, with the conclusions of the book, to look at, how does the CIA change when it does targeted killing and manhunting for more than a decade? What are the implications of a generation of CIA officers basically learning this? Not that the agency is not doing traditional espionage, but they're doing less of it, and it's been less of a priority. And what does that mean for the nation's premier intelligence service to be basically largely a manhunting service, and what is that going to mean for the future?
PJ, did either of these guys, in what they wrote, damage national security?
Well, they reveal sensitive information in some cases. I don't think they damage national security, because you turn that around. The fact that we have a vibrant free press in this country that is holding government to account day in and day out is a vitally important element of our democracy. But I think you have to put this in context. I mean, interesting in Clark's findings in that survey, there should be tension in the relationship because we have two different jobs. One is to conduct the government's business, and one to find out what the government is doing on behalf of the American people. I think also putting this in perspective, you think of a Jim Mattis, a Denny Blair, a Mike Hayden. We entered the military in the early 70s in the final stages of Vietnam, and there was a psychology within the military through the mid-'80s that the media was responsible for losing the war. It was not true, but that, so in the 70s, early 80s, could you get a high-level government official or military official to talk to a journalist? Heck no. It wasn't going to happen. When the U.S. military invaded Panama, we put soldiers on one island, we put journalists on another island, which led to something called the Seidel Commission to start to work on how the media, working with the Pentagon and the government, would cover military operations and in the future. But even there, through some great work by Clark and the McCormick Foundation, there was some relationship building done through various programs. This continued, through and after the Gulf War, where there were some tensions about, how the war was covered, access to the battlefield, and clearance of media reporting and so forth. Obviously, today, we're in an entirely different era, and you have a situation here where, present government officials, former government officials, outstanding journalists who have greatly established relationships, trading perspectives, and these deep relationships carry over when people come into and out of government. So the ability of these guys to get down into the rich details of how decisions are made and what the stakes were and so forth, that's basically built on these relationships that have developed particularly over the last 20 years. One other point, when I was at the White House in 1997, it was the 50th anniversary of the National Security Council, and C-SPAN asked if they could film one of their morning shows from the Situation Room, and we said yes, and so we looked at who might be available to start an interview, and we had Zbig Brzezinski and Alexander Haig in the first set of interviews, and Jay Scully goes, well, isn't this amazing? We're in the sit room. And Zbig goes, well, if I was still National Security Advisor, you wouldn't be here. But what these guys, what you guys try to do, and the other outstanding journalists in the audience, is when something big happens, it is figuring out how to get into the sit room. Who was there when the key decisions were made? What were you wrestling with in terms of options? And how was the process made? Who carried the day? There's always a political side to this. The president makes a decision, but who was the decisive voice? Was Secretary Gates on the one hand? Was it Secretary Clinton on the other hand? In the context of Libya, did the women in the national security senior staff gang up on the president? But this is, every once in a while you step over the line, but obviously it is a process by which, and also books which become now contemporaneous history of how we are informed about what the government does on our behalf.
Well, let's get into some of the stuff that goes on behind the scenes that the public doesn't get to see, about what makes it to print. The bargaining that goes on. Mark, there were some things that you put in your book that you had previously agreed not to publish. Can you describe some of that and what the process was?
Well, I mean, there's probably one instance you're talking about. I should say the paper agreed not to publish.
Oh, okay.
Whether I did or not.
Got it.
No, there was a case of, for instance, well, let me back up for a second and talk a little bit about the process. When we do a story, whether it's about the CIA, the Pentagon, whomever, we will always, contact the relevant agency or the White House, whomever, for comment for a story, and that to get their perspective or give them a chance to comment. That sometimes will trigger something where they will ask ask us not to either run a story or not to run certain details of a story. And once that happens, then it's sort of above my pay grade, where I don't make decisions about what to hold out of the paper. My editors do, and so then there's a process where if they're serious about this, they meaning the government or the government agency, they will contact one of our editors and sort of make their case for why something should not be in the paper. And there's sort of there's a process, there's a sort of escalation where if they're really serious, then their boss talks to my boss, who talks to then the boss's boss talks to the boss's boss, and ultimately it goes to the executive editor of the paper if it's really serious, and then the executive editor of the paper will make a decision. And that's just that happens, I would say, 3 or 4 times a year, maybe, or. And so, in the case of, there will be one case that we can discuss, and that was the case of this drone base that the CIA had built in Saudi Arabia, and there was a decision made at the paper not to reveal what country the base was located in, and the case that the government was making was that it would. The Saudis would shut it down if it was revealed in the press. And so there were all these. It had been in the press before about the Arabian Peninsula. And, there's only so many countries on the Arabian Peninsula, but there's a handful. And and the case was that they shut it down, and so the paper made the decision not to reveal Saudi Arabia. I then went on leave, and in the course of my reporting, I decided. Yemen became a big part of my book, and the CIA in Yemen became a fairly significant part of the book. And I felt that it was important to discuss if there's this drone base, the deal that was put in place in order to build it, and the fact that the Saudis allowed the United States to operate there, primarily because the first time it was used to kill an American citizen in Anwar al-Awlaki. And I think that when you're talking about a secret operation, a targeted killing operation done by the United States government to kill an American citizen, no matter whether you agree with that or not, I think the American people have a right to know as much as possible about that operation. And so anyway, I was doing the book, and then eventually the Times put it in the paper.
Because you let them know you were going to publish it.
Well, I thought it would. I thought it should be in the paper. I thought it should show up in the New York Times. And it was. I think that it was. And there was a little bit of. There was certainly grumbling on the part of the government about reporting that. My understanding that it's still operational. The Saudis haven't shut it down. And I think when we make, and this is the final point I'll make on this. When we make decisions about what to hold and what not to hold, we take very seriously any argument about if a compelling case is made that lives are going to be lost, that people's security are going to be endangered by us reporting in detail. That is the sort of highest standard, and we always listen to it, and that gets us that sort of gets the best audience. If there's an argument about, well, this will hurt our relationship with country X or country Y, I think it's a much lower standard, and you have to make a really good case that just because it's going to hurt diplomacy or going to be embarrassing to the United States, that's a reason to hold something out of the paper. And I know PJ had all sorts of examples with dealings with the Times on the WikiLeaks stuff, and we can talk about that, but that's just one example.
Got it. Dan?
Well, I actually ended up not reporting that detail about the drone base. And, in retrospect, I think it would have been legitimate to report it for all the reasons that Mark just said. When I did it, when I was writing my book, it was earlier, and none of the papers were reporting it, and it wasn't central to my story, but as I say, I think in retrospect it would have been okay to report it. I basically, the way I operated when I was doing the book, I was at that point on leave from Newsweek. Actually, I'd left Newsweek, so I was sort of out there on my own. And I had to have a kind of a no surprises policy, which I'm sure Mark does, all good reporters do, where you want to make sure that whoever you're writing about knows what you're going to say. And so I basically took my book to various agencies in the government that I was writing about. I didn't show the book to them, but I went through it. And the reason for that was, or a couple of reasons. One is it's a way to make sure you're not going to make serious mistakes, but also I wanted to make sure that the administration had an opportunity to say, hold on, there's an issue with this. I did not take specific things and go to the CIA and go to the White House and say, I'm thinking about reporting this. Is that a problem? I thought if I laid it all out for them, they'd be able to say, hold on, this has got real national security implications and we need to talk about this. And there were a couple of things which I did, other than the drone base, which I did hold back. And they were mostly in the context of special operations tactics, the methods of sources and methods. One of them had to do with a SEAL Team 6 operation on the high seas. I had a lot of detail about how it was done. And I was eventually persuaded that a couple of the details would conceivably take away the element of surprise in future operations. And again, I didn't think it was so important to my narrative that leaving those details out would be a problem, and so I did. There was another case in the bin Laden raid where when the administration was weighing various options, one of the options was the use of a classified weapon, which was not quite a drone, but it was a glide bomb, and it had not been deployed. For my book, where I'm examining a decision-making process and how, particularly in the bin Laden raid, which was so difficult and so high stakes, I thought, well, this is something that really is important for my story. And there was when you're doing a book, you don't have all those that whole chain of command that you can escalate up to, where you get a sense of, how serious it is. So it was just conversations that I had with various people in various agencies, and I was persuaded that by talking to a lot of people, that I would not be revealing enough detail about this particular weapon for it to be a problem, but there are others who thought I shouldn't report it. Ultimately, I think it was moot because damn Peter Bergen's book came out, and I think he had that detail in it. But that was one where I decided that it was worthwhile.
Okay. PJ, you have been in the position of trying to convince us not to publish. Can you describe some of your tortured examples?
Well, WikiLeaks is one example. Raymond Davis, the operative that ran into trouble and was apprehended in Pakistan, was another. I mean, sometimes these are hard arguments to make. When you think back to the WikiLeaks cables, one of the more renowned involved a Ukrainian nurse who took care of Muammar Gaddafi. It was a great cable. And as an aside, in the mayhem that followed in the Arab Spring, I think she was evacuated from Libya on an airplane chartered by the United States. So sometimes you can't make this stuff up. But on the one hand, you could not say that a cable that detailed some of the inner workings of Gaddafi's inner circle was necessarily going to pass the New York Times standard. On the other hand, in the immediate aftermath of WikiLeaks, Libyan agents started following our ambassador, Gene Kretz, and when he came home for consultations a few weeks after WikiLeaks, we didn't send him back because there were threats against his life. So there are ramifications when information that is classified, confidential, there are ripple effects, and you can't always predict what happens. We set up a daily process with the New York Times and occasionally The Guardian and Der Spiegel to talk through cables that they were planning not only to report on, but to put online.
This was before all of the cables got released.
This is before all of the cables came out. But the Times would offer us an opportunity to provide a perspective on the potential ramifications of those cables being released, and where we could make a compelling case that this activist who would talk to a diplomat would be put at risk. Those lines were excised from the cable. So we did appreciate that, and in one case we thought there was an intelligence operation in one part of the world that would be compromised, and the Times agreed not to post that particular cable. In the case of Raymond Davis, and this gives you a hint as to how leaks happen, Raymond Davis was a private security contractor hired by the Central Intelligence Agency to go in and do some work in Pakistan. He was involved in he was at a traffic light. There were two people that pulled up flanking his car. He felt a threat. He took action against the two individuals. A third person was killed when the embassy responded to the scene of the incident. He was jailed in Lahore. He had diplomatic status, but it took us some time with the help of Hussein Haqqani to get him out.
And he wasn't acknowledged. He wasn't on the list.
He
of
was not.
intelligence
Yeah.
operatives.
He was on a diplomatic list. He was on one, not on one. So there was some confusion about his diplomatic status. But as luck would have it, because of the Denver connection here in Colorado, you have fine journalists. Someone knocked on Raymond Davis's door, and the person who answered the door said, "Langley told us not to talk to the media."
Oops.
So there goes his cover. So I get a call from the CIA, and they go, "We need your help." He had diplomatic status, so we termed him as a diplomat working in a technical section of the United States Embassy in Islamabad. So I had to call Channel 9 in Denver that had posted a story that labeled Raymond Davis as a CIA operative, and said, "I need you to take that story off your website. Mr. Davis is in custody and his life is in danger." And the news director of Channel 9 said, "What's in it for me?" I said, "Well, you could save this guy's life." And I said, "Tell you what, when we get him out of Pakistan, I will agree to do as many interviews as you want and highlight Channel 9's cooperation in containing, in not reporting the CIA connection until we can negotiate his release." I had a similar conversation with Mark's boss, Bill Keller. I just said, "Look, you're reporting on it. I just need you to keep 3 initials out of the newspaper, CIA." And these guys came up with some very creative reporting as to how to convey the kind of work this guy was doing without, as per agreement. And I think 7 or 8 other news organizations had the same agreement, saying, "We won't report until somebody else does." I mean, it wouldn't have surprised me if someone like Mark or Eric Schmidt, who's here, had reported, and Mr. Davis, who's a private security contractor, frequently expressed a great admiration for the work of Leon Panetta. But 8 days later, Dawn newspaper reported it, Guardian picked it up, and we called Eric Schmidt and said, "Hey, you've been holding it. We appreciate it. You're released from the agreement." And I know Bill Keller, among others, took a lot of heat within his newsroom for making this agreement, but it was something that we valued greatly.
One point on that. It sort of speaks to what PJ is talking about. To some degree, these arrangements that get made are are kind of an anachronism to a degree, where you could get a group of news organizations together and people would make agreements to not report certain things. I mean, in this age we're in of Twitter and the internet, and where foreign news reporting is on our on the internet, on our screens, it's a tougher decision, because if someone else starts reporting things, you reach a point where you seem very foolish not to report it yourself, because then you're deliberately holding back. So even things that are on Twitter, like for instance, the new head of the CIA's clandestine service is still undercover, although he has been outed on Twitter, and was outed on Twitter within a day, and a lot of us know his name, and I think it's each individual news organization's decision about whether they want to. I mean, he's not in the field anymore, so it's less of a question of are you putting his life in danger? But I mean, these are decisions that these are calculations that didn't have to be made a decade ago.
And he's also making decisions which are part of our national policy, because I know that the argument is often made, if you're an operator in the field, that's one thing, but if you're doing something that you're going to have to testify in Congress, here's how it works and why, and here's our reasoning. Yeah. So that goes back and forth.
It's very rare for someone in that position to be undercover.
Now, that you mentioned Twitter, and that leads on to our next question, which is, can a covert operation really be kept covert? You guys both wrote about the bin Laden raid. That was tweeted as it was going on by someone in Abbottabad who saw the helicopters. I think, PJ, you had an interesting story you were relating to us about the media plan for Salih Naban in Somalia, the Al-Qaeda, the former Al-Shabaab operative.
Yeah, I was at the NCTC during the lighter era, and we were doing some work, and someone pulled me aside and just said, just so you know, there's going to be this operation in Somalia in the next few days, just so you're not surprised when it happens, because it might hit us at the State Department podium. And I said, what's our press posture? And they said, our press posture is assuming that our team will get into Somalia, knock this guy off, land, take a DNA sample, make sure we have the right guy, depart, and not be seen. I said, really? I just predicted it would be on CNN in 1 hour. I was wrong. It was in 2 hours. But the posture was, if it crosses into the public space, we'll deal with it when that happens. That is becoming less and less realistic in the age of Twitter, where someone scooped the president before he got to the podium to announce the death of bin Laden. I think this is obviously something that Denny Blair and Mike Hayden have great perspective on as well. But I mean, there are deeply held secrets, and then there are what I would call open secrets. Obviously, Leon Panetta said in a speech in Delhi last year that the United States is at war in the Fatah. But the United States government treats that war as secret. It's not a secret to the Pakistani people who hear certain technologies buzzing overhead and are occasionally a recipient of a Hellfire missile. So how the age-old rule of thumb about covert operations was plausible deniability. But in the age of social media combined with traditional media, plausible deniability is much more difficult to sustain.
And of course, it's especially true when the CIA has increasingly taken on this paramilitary role, and what it's doing is, Mark has written about, so much of what its covert operations are is kinetic. But you have to remember that there's still, a huge amount of what the CIA does in terms of collection and traditional espionage that is not something that you see because there's a bomb or because there's a missile strike. And I think it's a challenge for that kind of espionage, that kind of intelligence activity. But I imagine that social media, that a lot of those operations are still kept secret, and we don't learn about them.
I mean, would you guys...
Just to clarify, part of the situation that we're in is less about the United States we make a devil's bargain with a government of like Pakistan or a government like Yemen that is uncertain about being able to have a conversation with their people, rather than the fact that we do talk about these programs in general terms. We don't get into operational specificity, but in a global media environment, we used to be able to have that bifurcation during the Cold War. You could, something called propaganda. You could talk to this population and say one thing. You could talk to this population and say another thing. But now it's all one, merged, media environment. And I think we do have to do a better job of communicating on counterterrorism activities, particularly the use of remotely piloted vehicles.
Got it. Now, I did want to ask the leaks question. Have you guys changed the way you do business because of the investigations over the past year? Are your sources more skittish? Are you having to, arrange like, I'll be wearing the yellow carnation, see me at the corner of the park kind of thing? Or is that how you always did it?
No, red carnation.
Red carnation, sorry.
Going back to parking garage.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't changed what I do. There certainly is an effect of people being less willing to talk. I mean, I think that it's sort of problematic when if sort of reporters try to sort of take on the tradecraft of spies or start doing all sorts of different encryption, and I mean it may come to that, but I'm very wary of it, in part because partly because if you're sort of approaching sources for the first time and they might be on the fence about whether to talk, and you say, here's a phone, you can only use it to talk to me, and then you got to throw away because otherwise you might go to jail. Why is that person ever going to want to talk? I mean, the person is going to assume risk in talking, and it's going to be up to them. But usually I figure the people who I'm reaching out to probably know more about the government's capabilities than I do, and so they're taking that risk. There's no question that that in this climate people are considering the repercussions of talking, and so certainly people who you might be trying to talk to for the first time, or who have no relation with the press or no contact with the press in the past, I think many of them might think, what's in it for me, right? Why would I do this? Other people, there's sort of a gallows humor where other people you talk to on the phone, and there's just this, it's only half joking, but they'll talk to you on having a phone conversation, and then they'll just in the middle say, so whoever's listening to this, I just want them to know that I mean, it's just, they say it very matter-of-factly, but then when you step back, you're like, this is what it's come to. So it's a little scary.
Yeah.
I think this is a challenging climate right now for the obvious reasons, and I think that reporters, I mean, I don't have all sorts of sophisticated tradecraft. I don't think you need it, but I do think that you have to adjust certain things that were routine, the use of email, for example. I hope it's cyclical. Clearly there's a difference with the number of leak investigations, but now you're seeing, there was a tremendous amount of pushback and political pressure, and the Justice Department now has new guidelines, which I hope will make a difference. Perhaps there will be a shield law, although I'm still a little bit skeptical. But I think there is, in our system, always going to be an impulse for people to talk and tell their stories, and to want the public to understand why they do the things they do, how decisions get made, why certain activities are important. And I think that's an impulse that over the course of time won't be suppressed.
I would just say, different administrations approach these things differently and have different mindsets. I recall a story that Bob Woodward told recently at an event in Washington, where for one of his latest books, he was trying to get somebody on the phone, couldn't get him on the phone, so he knocked on his door after dinner. And the high-level official opened the door and started laughing and just said, "Are you still doing this?" We all remember the scenes from All the President's Men. I mean, it starts with the president or the principals. If in the case of the Clinton administration, our philosophy was talk to the media. My arrangement on the national security staff was talk to these journalists, give them a perspective, help them understand our policies. if you make news, let me know and let the National Security Advisor know so we don't read it in the morning paper and no one's surprised. And that was our philosophy. I think over time, administrations come in with a campaign mentality. They want to control, the message. It broadens out over time. So I do think that this is a cycle, but it goes back to enduring relationships. The rule of thumb is if you're a journalist and you're meeting a high-level official for the first time in the middle of the crisis, don't expect to have a lot of cooperation. By the same token, if you've got a relationship, you've got to establish a trust. I can give you a perspective and you'll report it fairly. I don't think those relationships will be disturbed even as we're going through this cycle.
Now, I have to bring up Edward Snowden and all of the documents being leaked, and I know all of us as reporters, do you all have the Twitter feed from Glenn Greenwald going straight to your cell phone? Because I do, because that's where he posts his next articles. We talked about how reporters feel under siege. How do folks in the intel and official world feel when something like this happens? Is there a siege mentality? No,
there's a sense of betrayal. I mean, understand, when you have a secret, it's about two things. It's about information and it's about sources and methods. When you look at much of the information that comes through intelligence circles validates what you already know or fundamentally changes what you know, but the information is not necessarily surprising. I mean, it can be startling occasionally, but it's really about protecting the manner in which we collect that information. And so if you're trying to describe a conversation in a sit room, you are necessarily dancing along a very, very tight line over top. Anything that happens in the sit room is by inference secret. However, we have an obligation, to help the American people understand all the equities that are being wrestled with as we develop policy. So you're always in that kind of gray area. But then when you have actual secret documents that are released, whether it's a handful in the case of Snowden or hundreds of thousands in the case of Bradley Manning, there is, by definition, very serious national security implications, by those releases. As Keith Alexander said earlier in the week, he can see that there have been changes in adversarial behavior, because of these things. So it's not about the conversation. It's about the having that conversation, but protecting particularly sources and methods that, when released, do create damage to national security.
Before I open it up to a couple of questions, just wanted to ask you guys, is the Risen case, is it on your mind? I mean, would you all go to jail for your sources?
Yeah. I think, it's the reporter-source relationship is a sacred relationship. I know that may sound grandiose, but particularly when you're reporting on these kinds of issues, when you make that kind of a promise, and sometimes it doesn't happen all that often, but sometimes you're asked by a source, how far would you go to protect me? And if you say, as I have, I would go to jail, you have an obligation to follow through on that. And so, Jim's a good friend of ours, and I do think about him, and we, I think, knowing Jim, that he will go all the way if he has to, and I'm hoping it doesn't get there. It's tough because the laws and the Supreme Court right now not really on our side in this kind of case. Now, the Justice Department, particularly now that it's issued these new guidelines, could take certain steps to avoid this confrontation, but that's going to be a tough decision for the Attorney General. It could withdraw the subpoena, but there are tough equities on both sides, and it's politically an extremely difficult decision, and so not at all clear to me that would happen.
Yeah, I think the ruling yesterday could have devastating consequences. I mean, we'll see what happens, and I hope it doesn't mean that lead to Jim having to go to jail. But I mean, I think that we do in going into this kind of reporting, you do understand that you are. There's a certain trust with your sources that you don't have in other places, in other kinds of reporting. And so if people are going to trust you enough to give you information, you've got to hold up your end of the bargain, and that might mean going to jail for them. So that's sort of implicit in all this.
I mean, I would say that on the one hand, I have a mixed view about a media shield law. The responsibility to protect classified information belongs to those of us who had security clearances. These guys are doing a different job. I thought the Justice Department made a huge mistake when they labeled James Rosen a co-conspirator. I think that was, and obviously the Attorney General has developed guidelines that have adjusted that perspective. By the same token, if a government employee willfully provides classified information without authorization to someone not authorized to have it, that's a crime. And if the media is reporting crime at the local level, the media should report crime, even those that benefit journalists. So, but at the end of the day, I would just, as a matter of principle, say that rather than have a journalist go to jail, if I'm responsible for that journalist going to jail, I would, as Scooter Libby did in his case, release that journalist from a pledge of confidentiality.
Got it. Let's open it up to a couple questions. I see John McLaughlin.
Thank you. This is really fascinating. A couple of observations and then a question. 2 observations. How similar your relationship with sources is to a CIA officer's relationship with sources. A CIA officer could probably have said 99% of what you said in talking about relationship with sources. Difference being, you're trying to find out our sources, and we're really not trying to find out yours.
But you are.
Second observation. What a weird era we live in, that the leak investigations are making your sources more reluctant to talk, while the leaks are making our sources reluctant to talk about the things that you would like to leak. How weird is that? So my question. And actually, most people in intelligence feel a sort of kinship with people in journalism because what you do is so similar to what we do. So it isn't necessarily always an adversarial relationship. But here's my question. As you've all dealt with intelligence agencies on the kind of negotiations you've described, how do you rate their ability to deal with you? In other words, how do you feel they deal with you fairly, openly, clearly? When I was at CIA, we did have a firm principle, which was, the guiding, if you remember the sainted Bill Harlow, the firm principle we had was never lie to the press. There are times when you might say, when you would ask a question, yes, that's right. And there are other times when you would say, I could answer that question, but I can't. In other words, I know, but I can't tell you. So the idea was to be very clear about what we could do and couldn't do, but never to lie. And I'm just wondering now, as you deal with intelligence agencies, do you feel it's a fair dialogue? Is it a good dialogue? Or is it always adversarial?
I don't think that adversarial and being a good dialogue are necessarily mutually exclusive. I think it's often adversarial. It should be. But I think it's always, in my experience, mostly been a very good conversation, and that there is a kind of social contract there between journalists and intelligence agencies that both sides generally try to understand the interests of the other side. It's hard often to know. I think the challenge for us and for our editors is sometimes intelligence, you only know what you know, and you sometimes are asked to take on faith certain assertions about the risk of damage that your story could cause. And that's where the trust becomes really important, because it's too difficult, I would assume, for the intelligence agency, whether it's the CIA or others, to be able to always explain, in a lot of detail, why the particular piece of information would put sources or methods at risk. It's our job to push as hard as we possibly can so that we can make an informed decision. But in my experience, it's generally been a pretty good relationship.
I mean, I think that the people you deal with on a daily basis in a press office of any agency, the good ones are people who have dealt with the press for a while and understand the position of the press, but ultimately they're taking cues from their bosses. And whether a public affairs shop is more forward-leaning or not, they're not freelancing. They're generally, if there is an inclination at the top of that organization to be more helpful from the press, then they will be. I think right now it's not. Maybe because we're in this climate, it's not necessarily even adversarial. It's almost like there's a freeze on everything. There's a freeze on getting basic information. I mean, we talk about, okay, let's take drone strikes, for instance. There was a period of time where you could get some basic information, and this is maybe sort of the game that everyone plays. It's a classified program, it's a covert operation, and yet we can somehow find out information about them. Well, now you can't even get that. It's sort of, what happened? I don't know what happened.
Which is ironic.
In this age of transparency, right?
Which is ironic given the fact that the administration has declassified aspects of the program.
Right.
I agree with Mark.
So it's hard. It's hard right now, and I think that to the point Dan was making about when the government will sort of engage on trying to withhold certain information out of a story, get it out of a story. I mean, the game is stacked in their favor. I mean, they obviously know more than they know. We don't know what they know, and so they can make a case for harm. And it's hard for us to assess that case. I think. The problem, though, is and the good public affairs officers and the good officials who deal with the press know that you can cry wolf and everything can be grave harm and grave damage. And if you're always at that level, the next time it happens and the next time it happens, it becomes devalued a bit. And so you said, well, that's what you said last time, and clearly that didn't happen.
Right.
So I think people who have done this from the government side long enough know that you only you only press the red button on cases that you really care about.
And we've got time for just one more quick question. Leslie.
In light of what Mark just said, PJ, how many times, percentage-wise, do you win the argument when you ask organizations to hold back? And how often did you have to say to your bosses, no, I mean, you're asking too much and it's unreasonable?
Sure. I mean, in the case of WikiLeaks, the only time we won the argument was basically if we could make a convincing argument that lives were at stake. And sometimes I'm the filter. I've got to say, hey, can you pull the king out of the story? No, and I'm obliged to do a good faith, effort on behalf of my team, knowing I already know what the answer is going to be, from the New York Times. So, but you work that. So part of this is it's a negotiation, and I always thought, okay, I don't want to ask for something I know they're not going to give, to preserve my credibility for when I really have to say this really makes a difference. But on the broader conversation, there's always this kind of how to what extent you engage, whether it was 60 Minutes or a guy like David Sanger, where you immediately pull your socks up because he's already 85% to a story. He probably has 5 or 10% of it where the facts are right, but the context might not be, and he's looking to fill out that 15%. So what is there's going to be a story. And so now you're in this kind of calculation, much like John McLaughlin talked about. Do I, in order to get him to adjust, those to improve the context, do I end up filling that 15%? But in the end, ultimately, since there's going to be a story on the front page of the New York Times, you want it to be as right as you can, And so that level of engagement is something that you just kind of navigate depending on the sensitivity of the information, but also by the need. If it's wrong on the front page of the New York Times, it happens occasionally, then you're a piñata for the next day or two, getting whacked around about, and then you're forced to say, okay, if that story's wrong, then what's wrong about it? I can't talk about it. And so you're in that impossible do loop where it's usually better to engage Dave and say, look, this is wrong. However, and provide whatever context you can up to the point where you just say, I can't do anymore.
Well, with that, I want to thank my panelists and to the audience. Now you know what's going on as we put pen to paper.
I am.